Hey guys, and welcome to the last video as part of our lesson on plants and the terrestrial environment. In this last video, we're going to talk all about soils. Soil really is one of the most valuable abiotic factors in the ecosystem. It has an effect on the plants that can grow in the ecosystem, which, as we know, directly impacts all of the other organisms that can survive there and even affects the abiotic environment itself. Um, if there's a change in the properties of the soil, the ecosystem, including both biotic and abiotic factors, are also going to change. It is a medium for plant growth. Ultimately, it receives water and more or less controls whether the water percolates down back into the aquifer or um, or it stays closer to the surface. It is a recycling system, so it can store different ions. It can facilitate the transfer of matter and energy from organism to organism up the food chain, and of course, it is an important part of the habitat. Soil is not just dirt. Okay, so it's not just this abiotic thing. It's not just little particles of rock. It is in fact a living ecosystem. And so we're just barely going to touch on that today, and mostly talk about some of the physical characteristics. So the abiotic component of soil is created through processes of both mechanical and chemical weathering. Mechanical weathering, you can think of like water seeping into crevices. That water freezes and thaws and essentially pushes those crevices larger and larger. Bits of rock break off, and kind of weather away over time. Wind um, kind of pushes dust and sand over the surface and just again wears down rock over time, creating smaller and smaller particles. Furthermore, organisms themselves are able to split rocks apart. So you can think of roots growing through rocks. As the root gets bigger, it pushes the rock farther and farther, and ultimately chunks will break off. And so ultimately, mechanical weathering is just breaking down these rocks and minerals into smaller and smaller particles. There's also chemical weathering. Certain organisms in the soil produce water, they produce oxygen, they produce acids, and essentially this facilitates the breakdown of rock. Also, there is a considerable addition of organic material, and so these dead organisms or shed leaves or branches, these tissues give rise to the more give rise to soil as well. Again, soil, not just this abiotic bits of rock, but also um, living ecosystem with biotic and abiotic components. If we were to take a core of soil or start digging deeper and deeper down, we would see that the soil isn't the same the deeper and deeper we go. In fact, it has a series of layers, or it is stratified, just like um, the forests above the ground, just like the aquatic environments that we've talked about so far. So always layer, layer, layer. Um, the soil profile, it can be characterized by a series of horizontal layers called horizons. We give um, a name to each of these layers. It always is a letter and then like some more of a description. So we can see here that like O is the organic layer, A, B, C, etc. Okay. So each one of these horizons, each one of these layers have very predictable physical, chemical, and biological characteristics. So let's take a look at some of these. Um, if you were to dig down from the surface of the earth farther and farther into the soil, we would see that the uppermost layer, the most superficial layer, is the organic layer. And so this is called the O layer. It is mostly um, decomposing, right? Partially decomposed or very far along decomposed plant matter, sometimes other organisms in there as well. And so this varies seasonally in places like South Jersey, where in the fall there's a lot of leaf litter, and then by the time you get to the next spring, a lot of it has broken down. And so this layer shrinks a little bit as the decomposition process continues. Okay, so once you get all of that litter or what is called humus out of the way, you encounter more or less the topsoil. So this is mineral soil. It is mostly derivatives of larger rocks. It contains some organic matter or humus, and it is very rich in nutrients. Right. And so this is where a lot of the nutrients, a lot of the ions that are needed for plants to grow is actually stored. And so because of the abundance of humus or organic matter, this layer generally has a pretty dark color compared to the rest. Next is the B horizon, sometimes called the subsoil. This is where a lot of mineral particles have accumulated. Um, it is, again, distinguished based on color, and a lot of the nutrients from farther above leach down into this layer, and they are stored there depending on how much clay is in the soil, and we'll get to that soon. Finally, the C horizon is derived from the original parent material, so it is the closest to bedrock, both in terms of location as well as composition. At this point, there's very little biological activity. There's no more humus at this layer. It really is the most inorganic of all the layers. So here is a soil profile. You can see that the colors change as you get deeper and deeper into the soil. Sometimes there is a very distinctive boundary, and other times there's not. There is one additional horizon that I want to point out in this soil profile that was not described in this soil profile, and that is the E horizon. E for alluviation. And so this is actually a white layer in between the O horizon, so organic, really nice and dark. The A horizon, okay, so here's the topsoil under the O horizon where there's, still living matter, right, and other debris, and the subsoil. Okay, so the subsoil we see here is kind of orange, just like it would be in South Jersey. And so this white layer is generally present in heavily vegetated areas like forests or grasslands. Essentially, what is happening here is that a lot of the minerals from the O and the A horizons leach down and they accumulate here underneath the topsoil. Right, so that is not present everywhere. Sometimes it is like a really thin, like half a centimeter white line. Again, other times it's not there at all. And so the behavior of the soil and availability of nutrients, availability of water, likeliness to erode during a storm, like all of these different factors are very much affected by soil texture. And so the soil texture is essentially talking about the inorganic component of the soil. More or less the size of the particles within the soil. Okay, so this is, or there are three essentially different types of, of soil, and they are classified based on the size of these particles. So the largest size is sand, right? We think of sand as being like, really fine, but sand is in fact the largest of the soil particles. You can see it with the naked eye, like individual grains of sand, you can absolutely see. Silt is the next smallest, it's the medium, and silt, difficult to see with the naked eye, but still feels a teeny bit gritty. And finally, clay. Clay is the smallest particle of all. It is microscopic, and so this just, it feels a lot smoother, silkier than the other two. Of course, soil can be made up of different proportions of each of these particles, so a certain portion of sand, silt, and clay. When you have a mixture of all three, we call it loam, L-O-A-M, loam. Um, and so in order to classify the soil based on soil texture, which again is really important because of, that the texture is important in determining nutrient and water availability. In order to classify a soil based on its texture, we have a series of tests which you in the lecture or at home are going to do. And so that uh, test ultimately uses um, this triangle made by the USGS, which essentially use this triangle to map out how much clay. So, for example, if your soil has 50% clay and 20% silt and what's that, 30% sand down here, you can kind of trace where those lines come together to determine, you essentially have clay soil. Okay, so essentially the intersection of all three of those lines is going to tell you what your soil texture is. All right, so more about that later. Kind of a fun lab, get to play around in the dirt just a little bit. Okay. And so soil texture, again, determines availability of water and nutrients. One of the reasons that one of the ways that it determines how much water is available is by how porous or permeable the soil is. Okay, so the larger the particle, the more space there's going to be in between those particles. Okay, so what we can see up here in this image is that uh, this soil here has very large particles, so these would be like sand. And so this is very porous. There's a lot of space in between those particles. And so what would happen in something like this is that, oops, sorry. Here we go. It is very permeable. So as soon as it rains, water is going to be able to percolate really quickly down through these pores. Right? On the other hand, kind of on the other side of the spectrum, here we have, maybe large particles like sand, but in between those large particles, there are many smaller particles filling in the pores that existed over here. And so now, this sand doesn't have a lot of pores, and therefore it is non-permeable. So water would travel really, really slowly through this soil. Okay, and of course, there is a gradient here. So here we see a lot of pores, but again, because of the abundance of smaller particles, it's still very difficult for water to make its way down through. Okay, and so again, the proportion of sand versus silt versus clay is going to determine how permeable, right, or how porous the sand or the soil actually is. And so this image down here, what we're seeing is a soil that is completely sand is going to be super permeable because it's so porous. On the other hand, smaller particles like silt, less porous and less permeable. Right. And finally, way over here, this is clay. What we can see is this is the least porous and permeable of all. It takes a really long time for water to percolate through clay as opposed to sand. Okay. So if you are a plant living in a really sandy soil, you might experience more drought, right? So, or rather less availability of water because any rain that does, any precipitation that does occur is going to slip through that sand really quickly and be inaccessible to the plant. On the other hand, a plant that lives in very clay soil or a soil that is rich in clay is going to encounter a lot more water. Water does not percolate, it doesn't drain through the soil very quickly, and therefore the soil is going to become very waterlogged. And so really loam, right, a combination of the three, is ideal for most plants. Okay. And so I have a couple more terms for you guys to think about. Water in the soil, right? Water in the soil is important, as we know, because plants need to take it up into the roots, okay, using water for photosynthesis. Um, Soil can become saturated with water when all of those pores are filled with water, right? So any excess can drain away, but saturated soil is, all of the pores are filled. Okay. In the field, we can measure something called field capacity, and this is where water is filling all of the pore spaces and held there, right? Not percolating through, but just held there because of um, kind of chemical interactions within the soil. Okay, and so we can measure this with, measuring the weight of the soil when it's wet, when it's right out in the field, baking it in the oven, therefore evaporating all the water, and seeing how much of that weight is just the particles itself. Okay, the wilting point. Again, because of chemical interactions between water and the particles themselves, soil moisture can be held in the soil in such a way that it is attracted to the particles and it's not able to be broken free and taken up by the plants. And so the wilting point is is the soil moisture level below which plants can no longer extract water. The attraction between the water and the particles is stronger than the attraction of the water into the root. And so as we can see from this graph, there is a difference between the wilting point and the field capacity. And ultimately the difference between these two, right? So how much water is there versus, how much water there would be and plants couldn't actually use that water. This is called the available water capacity. And so just a couple more terms um, for you to use. Water uptake from the soil, right? So this is really what's important here. Water uptake from the soil is absolutely critical because, as we know, every time those stomata open on the leaves, water is lost, and so that water must be replaced by water coming up from the soil, or else the plant will be harmed, right? It will become flaccid, it will wilt. Okay, so what we're seeing in this image is essentially more or less how the water is taken into the roots and therefore up the stem into the leaves. Here is the edge of the root. Here's a little root hair, right, increasing the surface area, and here are the particles of the soil. Cells of the root, and all the way over here, this is the xylem. So this is essentially the straw sucking up the water up to the leaves. Okay, so the way that water is taken into the roots is because there is negative pressure, right? So negative pressure in the root. Water is taken in via osmosis, more or less. As we know, water follows salt or the solutes, and there should be more solutes in the root than there are out here in the soil, and so water follows its pressure / osmotic gradient. It passes from cell to cell to cell, ultimately all the way over here to the xylem and up to the rest of the plant. Okay, so if we were to zoom into this cell right here, we would see this is the environment outside of the root. This is the environment inside the root. So water molecules in blue, solutes, right? In this case, sugar, actually, I'll get to that in a moment. Solutes here in red. And so as long as the solutes are more abundant in the root as opposed to outside the root, water follows the solute and is taken into the plant, right? Through aquaporins, through these little pores within the cell wall. Okay. Keep in mind that there are many ions in the soil. In fact, the plant needs a lot of these ions in order to grow, and we'll talk about that more in a moment as well. But there are solutes actually in the soil. And so the plant, again, has to strategically establish a concentration gradient of solutes to assure that osmosis is going in the right direction. Okay. And so the way that it does that is by actually translocation, right? So this process of um, right synthesizing sugar, right, sucrose, glucose in the leaves via photosynthesis, and instead of keeping all that sugar here in the leaves, generally sugar is transported down the stem, right, down through the phloem, and all the way into the roots. Right. So part of the story here is that the plant is storing the sugar in the roots for later, right? For when it actually needs to call in its reserves for later. But also this process is ensuring that water is taken into the roots. Okay, so all of these little red molecules here, these are representing sugar. And so the sugar made in the leaves transported down the phloem into the roots. These are creating a steep gradient, right? They're generating this osmotic potential to assure that there are more solutes in the roots than there are outside of the roots. Again, assuring that water enters the root and therefore is taken into the plant. Okay, and so I bring this up. This is important to our discussion of ecology because there are plenty of situations where there are just too many solutes. Okay, so too many solutes in the story. Okay, to orient you to this image, this is the normal situation. So non-saline soil, healthy, happy, non-salty soil. This is saline soil, right? So what you might find at the beach, right, or anywhere with salt water. Also, there are plenty of human applications, including fertilizer application, right? So when you add nitrogen, when you add phosphorus or potassium to your soil, when you're amending the soil too much, you are actually adding additional salts. Okay, so this is a highly fertilized crop or garden as well. Okay, so again, usually very are comparatively smaller abundance, smaller concentration of salts slash solutes in the soil than there is in the root itself. Okay, so there is um, a net influx of water into the root, and of course, suction up higher into the plant. However, when there is a higher concentration of salt, there is still um, there still might be a pressure gradient to an extent, but now you see that the soil has a very high osmotic pressure. Um, and so lots and lots of salts out here as opposed to in the root. And so less water is going to be taken into the root and up to the plant than there would be if it was not salty soil. Okay, and so this is important for our discussion because, what happens when there's a really high tide, right? And maybe a freshwater ecosystem is flooded with saline water, right? So with salt water. In the short term, plants can survive because the soil returns back to this situation fairly quickly. But with things like rising of the sea level, okay, which is being experienced now, what happens is that ocean water, that salty water, floods freshwater ecosystems, and even though the plants are surrounded by water, right, they are in a flooded environment now, they are not able to actually take up enough water because they are not adapted to living in the saltwater environment. And so this is actually a huge problem, a huge story here in southern and central New Jersey. Our sea levels have been rising and they have been flooding our freshwater ecosystems. And so as we can see here, the salt water inundating these freshwater pine forests has actually killed the pines in this area. Similarly, cedar trees, they die off and they leave what are called ghost forests. And you can see these like driving down the parkway. You can see these if you're driving through the pine barrens. They're called ghost forests. And so, um, you know, brackish or saltwater environments are still very valuable. It's not that one is better than the other, but uh, this flooding is taking away, sometimes uh, kind of rare ecosystems like Atlantic white cedar ecosystems. Furthermore, this is very flammable, right? So all of these dead standing trees increases the risk for forest fires as well. And of course, it's displacing all of the organisms that used to live in here. Okay, so again, when there are too many solutes because of additional nutrient inputs, because of flooding of the ocean, right, or saltwater flooding onto the coast, it can kill the freshwater vegetation that is adapted. Of course, you might be familiar with some plants that are able to live in a salty environment. So kind of the best example of this are mangroves. These would be seen, off the coasts of Florida and other warmer climates. Mangroves are trees that grow directly in the water. And so there's kind of two different problems here. The first one is they're growing in salt water, right? So they should be shriveling up and dying because of lack of water, even though they're surrounded by water. And secondly, their roots are in the water, right? Remember that you can overwater a plant, and when you overwater a plant, you are more or less you're like drowning the plant. They suffocate because they can't actually take oxygen into the roots to allow them to complete cell respiration. Right, so how do mangroves do it? Let's talk about some of these adaptations. First of all, salt tolerance, right? They need to be able to survive even though they are in an environment that is super salty. The aquaporins, the pores through which water passes to get into the roots, are highly specialized in mangroves. In fact, only, or so there's a couple different adaptations, but some of them, right, some of these aquaporins only take fresh water in via these specialized membrane proteins. And so the osmotic gradient is completely irrelevant, right? As long as there is a higher water pressure on the outside of the root, which of course there is because, lots and lots of water. As long as there's a higher pressure outside the root than there is inside the root, the water, right, fresh water, so salt, filtered out, only fresh water is taken into the root, right? So kind of cool. Another adaptation by other species of mangroves, right? Kind of two different strategies, is that the roots just allow as much water in as they possibly can. It's not filtered, not modified in any way. They are taking salt water into their root tissues. And so this salt water is, kind of sucked up that xylem just like any other water. But then what do you do with the salt? Right? So the salt is actually excreted onto some kind of disposable tissues, right? So onto these leaves, which can later fall off, right? So the leaves fall off and essentially dispose of the salt. Some mangroves have bark that kind of flakes off as well. So if the salt is excreted into the bark flakes off, the plant has essentially gotten rid of that salt. Right, so two kind of cool strategies to tolerate salt. And several more mangroves are wildly diverse. The second challenge that these mangroves are facing is essentially lack of oxygen. Okay, so again, you can overwater a plant because you are filling in all of those pores within the soil. And so there is no air pockets which hold oxygen, right? So usually plants actually breathe, they take oxygen in through their roots in order to complete cell respiration via those little pockets of air within the soil. But these guys are living in waterlogged soil. They're living in water in general. So they have to be able to get their oxygen from somewhere, right? Um, Oxygen, for the record, isn't transported down the xylem like water is. Instead, it has to be taken from the air. And so in these anaerobic environments, or at least environments that the plant can't actually get any oxygen out of, um, they have evolved to have really specialized roots. Okay, so uh, these are a series of different roots of different mangrove species, and some other species as well. Um, so we can see that there are these tiny little spikes that stick out above the water. Here, the roots are above the water, more little spikes. Um, these, not mangroves, but similar plants, these are called buttress roots, and essentially they are sticking out of waterlogged soil as well. And so what all of these have in common is that these roots are up in the air. They're not in the soil, they're not in the water. Okay, so they're sticking up, and they are covered with what are called lenticels. Right, so they're covered with these little spots here. And so what these are is specialized pores which repel water. Right? So they keep water out, and they only allow air in. And so these little roots, called pneumatophore roots, so pneuma for lung, right? So for breathing, and so like lung pore, lung opening roots sticking out above the anaerobic soil, sticking out above the water, allowing the plant's roots to literally breathe, taking in oxygen so they can complete cell respiration. Okay, so take home message, super cool, I think. These mangroves live in salty water. They tolerate salt because they either excrete it or they filter it out of their roots. And they are adapted to the anaerobic environment by these specialized roots, which selectively take in air. They only do this by sticking out above the water and the soil. And something that we touched upon the other day in class, mangroves are wildly important for coastal regions for a lot of different reasons. First of all, their habitat, right? A lot of organisms can live within the structure and protection of these roots. These roots stabilize an otherwise unstable sandy soil of the coast. Okay, so they reduce erosion, especially during storms. Um, they also act, they're important for filtration of substances from the soil. So they can, excuse me, they can take in, nutrients and everything that has washed into the water, and therefore reducing the chances of things like eutrophication / algal blooms. So mangroves, super important. Of course, this means that you don't have lovely sandy beachfront properties. And so, they are taking land for natural ecological processes instead of your nice fancy beach house. But their value to humans and all is perhaps underappreciated. All right, the final soil topics that I want to discuss with you guys is the ion exchange capacity. And so these essential soil cations in particular, so positively charged ions, are very important to plant growth. Right? So plants need things like potassium and calcium, magnesium. The plants need these ions in order to grow. The ions are taken up from the soil, which means that they must be held in the soil. Okay, so the cations themselves are held in the soil and therefore potentially available for use by the plants by negatively charged particles, right? As you might imagine, things that are negatively charged in the soil are humus, so detritus, broken down organic matter, and clay. A clay, of all three types of particle, clay has a negatively charged surface. Also, it is the smallest, and so it has the largest surface area available for tacking on or attracting all of these different cations. Okay, so a soil with a lot of humus, a soil with a lot of clay, has the potential or the capacity for storing ions, right? Stored ions as opposed to ions that percolate out of the soil is better for plants. Okay, so we can call the total number of negatively charged sites in a soil, so essentially how much clay, how much humus does the soil have, we can call this the cation exchange capacity. How much capacity does this soil have for storing cations necessary for plant growth, and frankly, for releasing them to the plant so that the plant can use it. Okay, the to add kind of another layer of complexity here, the cations on the surface of the clay, on the surface of the humus, attract anions. Okay, and together these hold water in the soil. All right, so remember a couple slides ago, I talked to you guys about the wilting point. Essentially there's still water in the soil, but it can't actually be taken up by the plants. Well, that water is attracted to the soil particles as well, right? So clay, right, it attracts both the cations needed for plant growth and the water needed for plant growth. Okay. So if there are fewer positively charged particles, that means that the anions aren't retained in the soils, but instead they quickly leach away, right? Leaching is, percolating down to lower horizons and therefore outside of an area that's accessible by plants. Okay. The cations on these soil particles are not static, and they shouldn't be static. Instead, these cations are in a continuous exchange, right? Ion exchange capacity, continuous exchange with the plants themselves. And so just real quick here, we can see lots of cations attracted to the negatively charged clay. The root, the plant, releases carbon dioxide as a byproduct of cell respiration, right, just like we do. And in the soil, this carbon dioxide, through the same reaction that we've seen in the ocean when there's extra carbon dioxide, right, ultimately producing bicarbonate and hydrogen, so acid. Also, the same thing that happens within our blood, right? So very common, very important reaction here, reversible reaction, actually. So anyway, root is super active, releases carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide leads to a more acidic environment around the root. These hydrogen ions, so this acid, actually displaces some of the cations on the clay. And so hydrogen ions release other essential cations from the soil so that the plant can take it up. Right, so this makes sense, like just a beautiful natural process. The more the plant works, the more it exhales CO2, the more hydrogen ions, the more protons are in the soil around the root, which liberates more resources for the plant to continue working so hard. Right, so again, beautiful, natural, seamless process here. Okay. As always, if there's too much of something, right, it is also harmful. And so acidity, as we saw, naturally releases these cations from the soil particle, making them more available for the plant. The thing is, of course, if there is excess hydrogen ions, so acidity is too much, the pH too low, this can displace essentially too many cations from the particles. And so if all of these have been displaced because of, maybe acid rain, right? Maybe some chemical spilled on the ground, right? So soil being too acidic means these guys are not held on the soil particle. And so they are going to be leached out of the soil, right? They're going to go with the water down, down, down through the different horizons and out of reach of the plants, right? So as always, kind of a Goldilocks principle here. A little bit of acid is good, right? Especially when it's released by the plant, because that means the plant is actively working, but too much because of various processes that is going to leach nutrients away from the soil. Okay, so one of the many reasons why, um, if you have a garden or you are growing crops, you need to test the soil. Soil that is too acidic um, is generally poor in nutrients. Okay. Another reason that, or another way that acidity is uh, influences plants and availability of ions is that acidity um, kind of frees up some some ions that are actually harmful to the plants, right? So aluminum, iron, both of these are harmful to plants for various reasons. And so as we can see on this graph down here, as the pH goes down, so more and more acidic, we see that um, aluminum becomes toxic to different types of plants, right? So from 2 to 5 is for sensitive species. So pH actually pretty close to the soil in South Jersey. So we have acidic soil as well. So toxic to sensitive species. And then um, when the pH continues to drop, it becomes toxic even to more tolerant species. Okay, so again, this is because there is so much hydrogen that it is displacing aluminum and iron from its storage, and now it becomes biologically available to plants. And so with that, I want to thank you all for watching this video. That is the end of our discussion for the aquatic environments and the plants that live within them. Talk to you next time. Thanks.